Dan sat at his usual seat in the classroom, near the window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desks, and the dull voice of the teacher echoed through the room. He wasn't really listening. His mind was elsewhere. Someone was staring at him. Again. He didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. It was the new girl. She had arrived a few weeks ago, and since then, she had barely spoken a word. Nobody seemed to pay much attention to her, but Dan had noticed her immediately, because she kept watching him. Every time he looked in her direction, her eyes were already on him. Today was no different. Slowly, Dan turned his head just enough to glance at her without making it obvious. There she was, sitting 2 rows behind him, hands resting on her desk, her dark eyes locked onto him without blinking. His stomach twisted. There was something unnatural about her gaze. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't like when people secretly look at someone they find interesting. It was something else, something deeper. Dan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Maybe he was just imagining things. Maybe she wasn't staring at him at all. But then, why did it feel like she was looking straight into his soul? The bell rang, breaking the silence. Students stood up, gathering their books and chatting with each other as they left the room. Dan hurried to pack his bag, but when he glanced back, the girl was still sitting in her chair, still staring at him. This was getting too weird. Dan decided he had had enough. He took a deep breath, turned around fully, and walked straight up to her desk. "Hey," he said, "why do you keep staring at me?" She didn't answer right away. Up close, she looked even stranger. Her skin was too smooth, too perfect, as if she wasn't real. Her eyes were too dark, too deep, as if they held something beyond human understanding. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Because you're different." Dan frowned. "What does that mean?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether she should say more. But before she could answer, another voice interrupted them. "Dan, come on, we're going to be late for practice." It was Kevin, one of his classmates. Dan hesitated, glancing back at the girl. But when he turned to look at her again, she was already gone. His heart skipped a beat. How had she moved so fast? 1 second she was there, and the next she wasn't. He looked around the classroom, but she was nowhere to be seen. Something was definitely wrong. As he walked out of the school, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "Because you're different." What did she mean? And why did it feel like she knew something about him that even he didn't? That night, as he lay in bed, he kept thinking about her. About the way she moved, the way she stared, the way she vanished so suddenly. He told himself it was just his imagination. Maybe she was just a weird girl, and that was all. But deep down he knew. Something was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. Dan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside his window. The clock on the wall showed 2:13 a.m., but sleep refused to come. His mind kept returning to the strange girl. "Because you're different." What did she mean? What did she see in him? The way she had stared at him, the way she had disappeared so quickly, it wasn't normal. Dan had seen quiet people before, shy students who kept to themselves, but she was different. There was something unnatural about her. A soft sound broke the silence. Dan froze. It was coming from his window. A light tap, then another, like fingertips gently pressing against the glass. His heart pounded. His house was on the 2nd floor. There was no balcony outside his window, no tree branch that could be knocking against it. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. She was there. The girl, standing outside his window. Dan's breath caught in his throat. His window was closed, but she was just standing there, staring at him through the glass, her dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking, unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, she raised her hand, and the window unlocked. Dan's body tensed. He wanted to run, to grab something for defense, but he couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, like something was holding him in place. The window slid open silently. The girl stepped inside. Dan could barely breathe. She moved without a sound, like a shadow slipping into the room. Her eyes never left him. "What?" His voice cracked. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took another step forward. The air in the room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped the moment she entered. "You need to listen," she finally said. Her voice was soft but urgent. "There isn't much time." Dan forced himself to sit up. His pulse was racing. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want from me?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a whisper. "My name is Vena," she said, "and I'm not from here." Dan's mind struggled to process her words. "Not from here. What does that mean?" "I'm not human." Silence filled the room. Dan felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "That's..." He shook his head. "That's not possible." Vanna took another step closer. "I know this is hard to believe," she said, "but you have to trust me. You are in danger." Dan swallowed hard. Danger? From what? Before she could answer, something outside caught her attention. She turned her head sharply toward the window, her body tensing. Then Dan heard it too. A low, unnatural hum. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from the sky. Vena's expression darkened. "They found us." Dan barely had time to react before a blinding light flashed through his window. His entire room lit up like daylight. The sound grew louder, a strange vibration that rattled the walls. "Get up," Vena said urgently. "We have to go. Now." Dan's body moved before his mind could catch up. He didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. He was no longer safe, and whatever was coming for him was already here. Dan's heart pounded as the strange humming sound grew louder. His entire room was filled with bright white light, almost blinding. The air felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. Vena grabbed his wrist. "We need to go. Now." Dan's mind raced. This couldn't be real. Just hours ago, he was in class, living a normal life. And now an alien girl was standing in his room, and something unknown was hunting him. "Who is after us?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Vena pulled him toward the window. "Not now. Move." Dan hesitated. "Are you crazy? This is the second floor." Vena didn't answer. Instead, she stepped onto the windowsill and leaped. Dan's breath caught in his throat. He rushed to the window, expecting to see her lying injured on the ground. But she wasn't. She landed gracefully, like a cat, completely unharmed. Then she looked up at him, her dark eyes glowing faintly in the night. "Jump," she said. Dan looked behind him. The light outside was growing stronger. The humming sound was turning into a deep, vibrating pulse that made his bones feel like they were shaking. Something was coming. Dan clenched his jaw. He had no choice. With a deep breath, he climbed onto the windowsill and jumped. The wind rushed past him as he fell, but before he hit the ground, Vena moved. She caught his arm and pulled him forward, breaking his fall. "No time to rest," she said, already running. "They're here." Dan stumbled but forced himself to keep up. They sprinted through his backyard and into the empty streets. It was past midnight, and everything was silent, except for the sound following them. Dan risked a glance over his shoulder. His breath caught. A dark figure hovered in the air above his house. It wasn't human. The shape was tall and thin, with glowing red eyes. Its body seemed to shift, like a shadow that wasn't fully solid. And then it moved. 1 second it was floating. The next it was rushing toward them with unnatural speed. Dan's instincts screamed at him to run faster. "What is that thing?" Vena didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on his wrist and pulled him around a corner. They dashed into an alleyway, pressing themselves against the cold brick wall. Dan struggled to catch his breath. "What?" he gasped. "What do they want from me?" Vena peeked around the corner, her expression tense. "They're called hunters," she whispered. "They track people like you." Dan's chest tightened. "People like me." She turned to face him. "Dan, listen carefully. You are not an ordinary human. There's something inside you, something they want." Dan shook his head. "That's crazy. I'm just a normal guy." Vena's gaze was intense. "No, you're not." Before he could argue, the humming sound returned. This time, it was much closer. Vena's eyes widened. "They found us." A shadow moved at the entrance of the alley. Dan felt his body go cold. The hunter had arrived. It stepped forward. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Dan. Its voice was a whisper, but it echoed unnaturally. "Target located." Dan felt frozen in place. The hunter raised a hand, long, sharp fingers reaching toward him. Vena moved fast. She grabbed a small device from her pocket and threw it to the ground. A pulse of blue light exploded outward, hitting the hunter square in the chest. The creature hissed and stumbled back. The alleyway flickered like a glitching screen, as if reality itself had been disturbed. "Run," Vena shouted. Dan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his legs burning as he pushed himself forward. Vena stayed close beside him, her movements impossibly fast and graceful. They had escaped for now. But Dan knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. Dan's legs burned as he ran through the empty streets. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. The cold night air stung his face, but he didn't dare slow down. Vena was running beside him, her movements smooth and controlled. She barely looked tired. Meanwhile, Dan felt like his lungs were going to burst. Behind them, the hunter's eerie whisper echoed through the streets. "Target must not escape." Dan risked a glance back. The hunter was moving fast, almost gliding across the ground. Its red eyes glowed like fire, and its body flickered like a shadow. "We're not fast enough," Dan gasped. Vena didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his arm and suddenly pulled him into a dark alleyway. She pushed him against the wall and placed a finger on her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. Dan pressed himself against the cold bricks, barely breathing. His whole body was shaking. The hunter stopped at the entrance of the alley. Its red eyes scanned the darkness. Its body shifted, as if it was trying to sense them. Dan clenched his fists. He wanted to run, to escape, but he knew if he moved even an inch, the creature would hear him. Vena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver device. She pressed a button, and suddenly, a low-frequency hum filled the air. The hunter twitched. Its red eyes flickered, and for a moment, it seemed confused. Then, slowly, it turned away and disappeared into the night. Dan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His legs felt weak. "What? What was that?" he whispered. Vena exhaled. "A sound disruptor. It messes with their tracking abilities, but it won't last long. We need to keep moving." Dan shook his head. "No, not until you tell me what's going on." He looked at her, eyes burning with frustration. "Who are you? What do they want from me?" Vena hesitated, then sighed. "All right, you deserve the truth." She looked up at the night sky, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she turned back to him. "Dan, have you ever wondered why humans are different?" Dan frowned. "What do you mean?" Vena stepped closer. "Humans are unlike any other species in the galaxy. You are stronger, faster, and more adaptable than most. Your minds are unpredictable. Your instincts are sharp. You should not be this advanced." Dan felt a chill go down his spine. "Are you saying we're not normal?" Vena nodded. "A long time ago, humans were feared across the universe. You were warriors, conquerors. Entire civilizations trembled at your name." Dan's head spun. "That's impossible. We don't even have space travel yet." Vena's expression darkened. Because something happened. Someone erased your past. Dan's breath caught. Erased. Yes, Vena said. All records of humanity's past were wiped from history. Even your own kind forgot who they were. But something remained. Something hidden deep inside your DNA. Dan's mind was struggling to keep up. And that's why the hunters are after me. Vena nodded. Yes, they search for people like you. Humans who still carry traces of the past. Something inside you is awakening, Dan. And the hunters don't want that to happen. Dan took a shaky step back. His whole life, he had been ordinary. A normal kid in a normal town. And now he was being told he was part of some lost warrior race. It didn't make sense. And yet, deep inside, something about it felt right. Before he could respond, Vena grabbed his arm. We need to go. More will come soon. Dan swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to run home, to pretend none of this was real. But he knew that wasn't an option anymore. He wasn't safe, and he wasn't normal. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. Okay, let's go. Without another word, they disappeared into the night. Dan followed Vena through the dark streets, his mind spinning with everything she had just told him. A lost warrior race, erased history. Something inside him was awakening. It all sounded impossible. And yet, deep down, he felt it. A strange energy was building inside him, something he had never noticed before. His senses felt sharper. His body felt lighter, stronger, more aware of every movement. Was it fear? Adrenaline? Or was it something else? Vena suddenly stopped in front of an old, abandoned warehouse. Its metal doors were rusted, and broken windows made it look like no one had entered in years. In here, she said, pushing the door open. Dan hesitated. You sure this is safe? Vena looked at him. Nowhere is safe, but this is better than the streets. Dan sighed and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and metal. The floor was covered in broken crates and old machinery. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time. Vena moved quickly, pulling something from her bag. A small metallic device. She pressed a button, and suddenly, the air around them shimmered. Dan's eyes widened. What was that? A cloaking field, Vena said. It will hide us for a while. Dan exhaled. Okay, now what? Vena turned to him. Her expression was serious. Now, you need to understand who you really are. Dan rubbed his forehead. You keep saying I'm different. That humans were warriors. But how does that help us right now? Vena took a step closer. Because if you don't unlock your true potential, you won't survive. Dan's stomach twisted. You mean, I have powers? Vena nodded. Not in the way you think. Your strength, speed, instincts, they are far beyond normal humans. They've been sleeping inside you, but now they're waking up. Dan shook his head. That's crazy. I can't do anything special. Vena's eyes locked onto his. Then let's find out. Before he could react, she moved. Fast. Her fist shot toward his face. Dan barely had time to think. His body moved on its own. He ducked. The punch missed him by an inch. His heart raced. What the? Vena didn't stop. She spun, kicking toward his chest. Again, Dan reacted without thinking. His arms came up, blocking the hit. The impact sent him stumbling back, but he didn't fall. Something was different. He wasn't reacting like a normal person. He was faster, more aware, as if his body knew what to do before his brain could process it. Vena smiled. See, you're not normal. Dan stared at his hands. How? The hunters know this, Vena said. That's why they're after you. If you unlock your full potential, you could fight them. You could stop them. Dan swallowed hard. A part of him wanted to run, to pretend none of this was real. But another part, the part that had dodged Vena's attacks, knew she was right. Something inside him was waking up. And soon, He would have no choice but to use it. Before he could say anything, a loud sound echoed through the warehouse. A deep, unnatural hum. Dan and Vena looked at each other. The hunters had found them. A deep, unnatural hum filled the warehouse, making the air feel heavy. Dan's pulse quickened. He turned to Vena, who was already reaching for a small device from her belt. "They found us," she muttered. Dan swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Vena's eyes were sharp. "We fight." Dan's stomach twisted. "Fight? Are you serious? I don't even know how." Vena didn't answer. Instead, she tossed him a small metallic rod. Dan caught it, confused. "What is this?" he asked. Before she could explain, the warehouse doors exploded inward. A powerful shockwave sent dust and metal flying as a dark figure stepped through the entrance. The hunter. Its red eyes glowed in the dim light, its shadowy form shifting unnaturally. Dan felt his body freeze. It looked even more terrifying up close. The hunter took a step forward, its voice echoing like a whisper in his mind. "Target must be taken." Vena didn't wait. She moved in a flash, pulling out a weapon, a sleek, glowing blade. She slashed toward the hunter, but it dodged effortlessly. The creature turned toward Dan. "Come with us, or be destroyed." Dan clenched his fists. Fear gripped him, but deep inside, something else stirred. The voice in his mind whispered, "Move." Before he could think, his body reacted. The moment the hunter lunged at him, Dan rolled to the side. The metallic rod in his hand suddenly extended with a crackle of blue energy, a weapon. Dan had no idea how to use it, but his instincts guided him. The hunter turned, swiping with its clawed hand. Dan blocked with the rod. Sparks flew as the energy clashed. The impact sent him sliding back, but he didn't fall. Vena shouted, "Good. Trust your instincts." Dan barely had time to process before the hunter attacked again. It moved like a blur, too fast to follow with his eyes. But somehow his body reacted before he could think. He ducked, sidestepped, and struck with the rod. The blue energy crackled as it hit the hunter's side. The creature let out a distorted screech and stumbled back. Dan's eyes widened. "I hit it." Vena smirked. "Told you. You're stronger than you think." But the hunter wasn't done. It straightened, its red eyes burning brighter. Its body shifted, growing darker, more solid. Then it moved. Too fast. Dan barely saw the attack before it hit him. A force like a hammer struck his chest, sending him flying backward. He crashed into an old metal crate, pain exploding through his ribs. Vena shouted his name, but the hunter ignored her. It stepped toward him, raising a clawed hand. Dan groaned, struggling to stand. His entire body ached. The hunter loomed over him, ready to strike. Then something snapped inside him. A wave of energy surged through his veins. His heartbeat slowed. His senses sharpened. The pain faded. For the first time, he felt it. The power. As the hunter's claws slashed down, Dan's hand moved on its own. He caught the attack midair. The hunter froze. Dan tightened his grip, his fingers burning with an unseen force. The air around him crackled. A deep instinct took over, guiding his movements. With a roar, he twisted his body and hurled the hunter across the warehouse. The creature crashed through a pile of crates, sending debris flying. Dan stood, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with something else. Power. Vena stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You just." The hunter rose again, but this time, its red eyes flickered weakly. It let out a distorted growl before vanishing into thin air. It had retreated. Dan exhaled, his body suddenly exhausted. He collapsed to one knee, trying to catch his breath. Vena walked over, offering him a hand. "Now do you believe me?" Dan looked up at her, his mind still racing. Something inside him had awakened. And now, there was no turning back. Dan sat on the cold warehouse floor, his breath still heavy from the fight. His whole body ached, but deep inside, something felt different. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was a strange, powerful energy, like a fire burning just beneath his skin. He had fought the hunter, and won. Vena crouched beside him, watching him closely. "How do you feel?" Dan let out a short laugh. "Like I got hit by a truck." She smirked. "That's normal. Your body is waking up. You're stronger than before." Dan looked down at his hands. They were still shaking slightly, but he wasn't sure if it was from fear or excitement. "So, what now?" The hunter ran away. "Are we safe?" Vena's expression darkened. "No, that was just one. More will come. And next time, they'll be ready for you." Dan swallowed hard. He had barely survived that fight. If more were coming, how was he supposed to stop them? Vena stood up. "We need to leave. This place isn't safe anymore." Dan forced himself to his feet, ignoring the soreness in his muscles. "Where do we go?" "There's someone we need to meet," she said. "Someone who can tell you the full truth about who you are." Dan frowned. "Another alien?" Vena hesitated. "Not exactly." Before he could ask more, she turned and led the way out of the warehouse. Dan followed, stepping into the cold night air. The streets were silent, but something about them felt wrong. The hairs on Dan's neck stood up. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Vena nodded. "We're being watched." Dan's pulse quickened. He looked around, but the street seemed empty. No movement, no sound, just darkness. Then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You shouldn't have survived." Dan spun around, his heart pounding. A man stepped out of the alley. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face half hidden by shadows. But his eyes were cold and sharp, filled with something dangerous. Dan tensed. "Who are you?" The man smiled slightly. "Someone who knows what you are, and someone who will stop you before you become a threat." Dan's stomach tightened. "You're with the hunters." The man shook his head. "No, the hunters are just tools. They follow orders. I am different." Vena stepped forward, her body tense. "You're a guardian." Dan looked at her. "A what?" The man's smile widened. "So you do know about us, Vena." She clenched her fists. "I thought your kind was gone." The man chuckled. "Oh, we're very much alive. And we've been watching humans for a long time." His gaze shifted to Dan. "Especially ones like him." Dan's fists tightened. "Why? What do you want from me?" The man's smile faded. "To stop you before it's too late." And then he moved. Faster than the hunter. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, he was right in front of Dan. Dan barely had time to react. The man's hand shot forward, aiming for his chest. But something inside Dan screamed move. His body acted on its own. He twisted to the side, the man's attack barely missing him. A gust of wind followed the strike, powerful enough to crack the pavement. Dan's eyes widened. If that had hit him, he wouldn't be standing right now. Vena drew her weapon, her glowing blade humming with energy. She slashed at the man, but he dodged effortlessly, like he had seen the attack before it even happened. Then he struck back. Vena blocked, but the force of the hit sent her skidding backward. Dan clenched his fists. The fire inside him burned hotter. He couldn't just stand there. He had to fight. He focused, letting his instincts take over. His breath slowed. His mind cleared. Then he moved. He dashed forward, swinging his energy rod. The man blocked it with his bare hand, but Dan didn't stop. He spun, dodged, and struck again. For the first time, the man looked surprised. Interesting. Dan pushed harder, feeling the power inside him growing. He wasn't just reacting, he was fighting back. The man took a step back, watching him closely. Then he smirked. "You're getting stronger, but you're not ready yet." Before Dan could attack again, the man vanished, disappearing into thin air like a shadow. Dan staggered back, breathing hard. What was that? Vena sheathed her weapon. A guardian. They don't just hunt humans like you. They control what happens to your kind. Dan's blood ran cold. The hunters were bad enough, but now he had an even bigger enemy. Dan's breathing was heavy, his heart still racing from the fight. His body ached, but he couldn't focus on the pain. His mind was filled with questions. The guardian had disappeared, but his words still echoed in Dan's head. You're getting stronger, but you're not ready yet. Dan turned to Vena. What did he mean? Why am I not ready? Vena looked at him, her face serious. Because your power is only half awake. You've only scratched the surface of what you can do. Dan clenched his fists. Then how do I unlock the rest? Vena hesitated, then sighed. There's only one way. You need to remember. Dan frowned. Remember what? She met his eyes. Who you were before. Dan felt a cold chill. Before. What do you mean? Vena stepped closer. Your memories, Dan. Your real memories. They were taken from you. Erased. Dan's head spun. That's impossible. I remember my life. My family. My childhood. Vena shook her head. No, those memories were placed there. They aren't real. Dan took a step back. You're lying. I'm not, she said calmly. And deep inside, you already know it. Dan opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped. Something inside him felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He had never questioned his past before, but now that he thought about it, there were gaps, strange moments that didn't make sense, like the way he sometimes knew things he had never learned, or how his body reacted faster than his mind. Had his past really been erased? Dan swallowed hard. How do I get my memories back? Vena pulled a small device from her belt. It was round, silver, and pulsing with blue light. This will unlock what was taken from you. Dan stared at it. His hands felt sweaty. And what if I don't want to remember? Vena's expression softened. Then you'll never be able to stop them. Dan looked at the device again. If he didn't do this, he would never know the truth. And if he didn't know the truth, he would never be strong enough to fight back. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. Do it. Vena pressed a button. The device hummed and released a soft, glowing light. Dan's vision blurred. Then, a rush of images flooded his mind. Not just images, memories. He saw battles, massive wars in space, ships burning, entire planets crumbling. He saw himself, but not as he was now. He was older, stronger, leading others like him into war. Humans were not weak. They were feared. They were warriors. They had ruled the stars. Then came the betrayal. A great war had broken out. Humanity had been winning, until their enemies did the unthinkable. They didn't just attack. They erased. A weapon unlike anything ever seen had wiped humanity's history from existence. Their minds had been rewritten, their memories locked away. Humanity was turned into something small, weak, controlled. And now, the Guardians were making sure it stayed that way. The images faded, and Dan gasped, his body shaking. He fell to his knees, his mind reeling. The truth was overwhelming. Vena knelt beside him. Dan. He looked up at her, his eyes burning. I remember. His hands clenched into fists. He wasn't just any human. He was a warrior. And it was time to finish what had been started. Dan's breath was heavy as the memories settled in his mind. His hands still shook, but not from fear, from power. He wasn't just an ordinary human. He was a warrior, a leader, someone who had fought for humanity before their history was erased. And now he would fight again. Vena watched him carefully. How do you feel? Dan exhaled slowly, like I finally know who I am. She nodded. Then you know what you must do. Dan clenched his fists. The guardians, the hunters, they won't stop until I'm dead. Until all humans like me are gone. Vena placed a hand on his shoulder. But now you have the power to fight back. Dan looked at her, determination burning in his eyes. Then let's end this. The final battle begins. Vena led Dan through the city's dark streets. They moved fast, avoiding patrols, heading toward an abandoned structure on the outskirts. The hunters will return soon, she said, but they won't come alone. The guardians know you're awake now. Dan tightened his grip on the energy rod. He could feel its power flowing through him, responding to his touch. Then we hit them first. Vena smirked. Now you're thinking like a warrior. They reached the structure, a ruined tower covered in vines and rusted metal. This is it, Vena said. The guardians have a control station inside. If we take it out, we cut off their ability to track others like you. Dan nodded. Then let's move. The two slipped inside, silent as shadows. The air was thick with the hum of machinery. Red lights flickered along the walls, marking the security systems. Then, a voice echoed from above. You've come far. Dan and Vena spun around. The guardian from before stood on a high platform, looking down at them. His dark coat swayed, and his cold eyes gleamed. But it ends here, the guardian said. The air around him shifted. Energy pulsed from his body, crackling with power. Dan's muscles tensed. He could feel the raw force coming from the guardian. He was stronger than before. Vena whispered, He's fully activated. Dan took a deep breath. So am I. The guardian moved first. In a flash, he was in front of Dan, his fist coming down like a hammer. Dan dodged at the last second. The impact shattered the ground where he had just stood. He countered, swinging his energy rod. The weapon crackled as it struck the guardian's side, sending a shockwave through the air. The guardian staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, he smiled. Good, he said, but not enough. Then he attacked again. Faster, stronger. Dan barely kept up, blocking, dodging, striking when he could. But the guardian was relentless. Each hit sent a jolt of pain through Dan's body. Then, with a powerful blow, the guardian knocked him back. Dan crashed into a wall, coughing. Vena tried to attack, but the guardian threw her aside like she was nothing. Dan gritted his teeth. His body hurt, but he couldn't stop now. He had come too far. He had to win. Then he felt it, deep inside, the last piece of his power unlocking. The fire inside him roared to life. His vision sharpened. His strength surged. Dan pushed off the ground, launching himself at the guardian with blinding speed. This time, he wasn't just reacting. He was in control. Their attacks clashed, blow for blow, strike for strike. But now, Dan was faster, stronger. With one final move, he dodged the guardian's attack and drove his energy rod straight into his chest. A pulse of blue light exploded outward. The guardian's eyes widened in shock. Then, his body disintegrated into nothing. It was over. Dan stood there, breathing hard. The air was silent. Vena got up, staring at him. You did it. Dan exhaled. He had won. But he knew this was just the beginning. Humanity had been erased once. But now, they would rise again.